thanks to everyone who's joining us on a sunny afternoon. My name's Anna Pincus. I'm the director of Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. I'm the founder and coordinator of Refugee Tales, and I'm here to introduce Dina to you, although I know she needs no introduction. So Dina Nayeri, novelist, essayist, short story writer. Her debut novel was A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, translated into 14 languages, not bad for a start. Her second novel, Refuge, was published in 2017, had a focus on the Iranian refugee community in the Netherlands, and Dina herself was an Iranian refugee. The Ungrateful Refugee, published in 2019, looks at what it's like to be a refugee and the way society can emphasize refugee narratives around success and succeeding against the odds, and how topical that feels. We saw so many stories in the British press of key workers, valiant key workers, in the time of the first lockdown. The book looks at how refugees reconcile their old lives with their new home and looks at the burden of gratitude expected by the host nation. Ungrateful Refugee won many prizes and was followed by a book, The Waiting Place, looking at lives in a refugee camp in Greece. Dina's been a wonderful friend to Refugee Tales, so we contacted her out of the blue. Instantly, she said she was delighted to collaborate with us. She wrote the wonderful Activist's Tale that you'll be hearing her reading a part of this afternoon. And she read it online for us in Refugee Tales Online last summer. Her tale will be published in the 4th anthology of Refugee Tales that's being published on the 28th of July, a very memorable date, the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome Dina here. Hi Dina, how are you?
Hi Anna, hi, thank you for having me. I'm great. I'm so honored to be here and so delighted. And thank you for that incredible introduction.
I'm sorry we can't meet in person, but it's great to reach across the miles this way anyway. And this is the first event in the Migration Matters Festival, which is part of Refugee Week in the UK. And the theme is wonderful. It's We Cannot Walk Alone.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that has great resonances for us at Refugee Tales. Forgive me, I'm going to start off by speaking even longer, just to introduce the context of the project to you all, so you can see why Dina was a perfect person for us to connect with. After that, Dina will read from her tale. We'll then be in conversation, and then we'll open the conversation out to you all. So please be thinking of questions you'd like to ask as we're speaking. If you're on Zoom, you can put those in the Q&A or in the chat. And we have Christina here with us this afternoon as our moderator, and big thanks to her. So just to give a little of the context as background, Refugee Tales is rooted in the work of a charity, Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. It's a charity that supports people in immigration detention at Gatwick. Now, if you've flown into Gatwick, you may not even have noticed that there are immigration centres there on the South Perimeter Road, but they're built on a Category B prison model. But the people who are held there aren't there because they've committed a crime. They're held there as an administrative convenience while their immigration cases proceed. They're held there as an administrative convenience, but they have no idea how long they will be held. The UK is the only country in Western Europe that detains people indefinitely for immigration purposes. And the longest I know someone to have been detained is 9 years. So imagine the impact on mental health of not knowing how long you'll be in detention. And Dina alludes to this in her tale about the counting up and the counting down of time, because in prison, people count up the days to the end of the sentence, or rather count them down. In detention, they count them up, and they count them up to an uncertain future. They have no idea how long they will be detained, and that has a terrible impact upon the mental health of people in detention. So into this context step our 70 volunteers who befriend people and visit them on a weekly basis while they're in detention. And they were told repeatedly by people in the detention centres that they wished their stories could be heard, but they didn't feel safe to share them in the first person, either because they were asylum seekers, they didn't want their country or their governments to know where they were, because of the stigma of being in detention, or because they feared that there might be repercussions from the Home Office on their asylum cases. So we started Refugee Tales, which takes the model of the Canterbury Tales, that great work of fiction, and its model of journeying and sharing tales. And we connected people in detention with famous writers who amplified their voices. We went on a long walk every year. Every evening of the walk, wherever we had arrived, the tales would be shared. And crucially, the tales were shared in anthologies that people with experience of detention then used as tools to have conversations with parliamentarians and people of influence. So we were very keen that people weren't trapped in a victim narrative, but that they came to a stage where they could leave those stories of their own suffering in the past, but see people of influence and say, I was detained, this is the reality of detention, this is what needs to change. So into this context stepped Dina, and she worked with someone to write the activist's tale. Dina, do you want to say anything about that collaboration and then share the tale with us, please? Thank you.
Well, I have to say that first, when I was approached, to do this by Anna, I felt absolutely honored because I knew the anthology. I mean, I knew the other three that had been done and met some of the writers and had even been on panels with them. And I thought it was such an important project because I, was at a point in my own life and in my writing where I wanted to look outward to other stories, to newer stories, to the story that I lived through 30 years ago. It repeats and it hasn't stopped. It's gotten worse. And I was very much interested in looking outward to what's happening now and to, using what I have of narrative ability and understanding of Western storytelling to, offer that to someone else and to tell their story. So when they came to me, I thought, wow, I mean, I would have come to you. I think this is such an honor. And I would love for, to lend my voice to this. And then, for a couple of weeks, we tried to set up a conversation with Suleiman, and we had technical issues. And I remember each time we something fell through, I felt so disappointed not to get to talk to him. And then when we finally did, it was this kind of, the story poured out of him so naturally, so beautifully, so full of just visceral, gorgeous detail. And I hardly felt, kind of like that. I didn't even want to touch it. I almost wanted to kind of hand it off exactly as he told it. But of course, there was narrative things to be done, and we did those. And I think it was the first time in my life, in my writing career, where I have actually been very, very nervous about what someone is going to read it is going to say, because it is such a responsibility to tell someone else's story in this way. When you tell your own stories, well, editors may or may not like it, but you're not doing them any kind of disservice or injustice or harm. So I was delighted that Suleiman liked this story, and I loved working with him, and I thought his story was one of the most poignant, moving. And I think what's important about this story is that it is a story about just this man with an incredible amount of hope, just pulling himself out of an ugly place, even though physically he continues to be in the ugly place. Even in detention, he lifted himself out, his spirits up through, community joys, through cooking, which you'll hear about when I read. Oh, should I start reading?
That'd be lovely. Thank you, Dina.
But before I do that, can I ask you guys, is this okay internet-wise? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Must check that, as I am in a small village. Okay, so this is partway through the activist tale. Solomon knew nothing about asylum, about his rights, or Western tactics for deciding what is true. He knew a single vital word: refugee, though even that was a hazy notion, a status that he didn't realize he'd have to claim or fight for. He knew that the West had laws, humanitarian agreements, and money to care for vulnerable and endangered people. That seemed a simple enough thing. There was a pact between European countries to rescue those facing death, and that pact would save him. He packed some clothes and the passport in a rucksack and headed to the airport. He had no money, no proof of his real identity. I should say the passport was fake, but that's For 6 hours over the Atlantic coastline, Solomon rubbed his thumb over the false passport in his pocket, his friend's face and name inside, his legs shaking as the hour drew closer. My father vanished into a police station. My life was threatened. I need help. None of the other passengers looked like refugees. They were European holidaymakers or part of the Gambian diaspora. Would he be punished for entering the UK illegally? Surely no one expects paperwork with a machete hanging over your head. He would be okay, he reassured himself. He would get to safety, tell them what happened, then fill out whatever papers they needed. In the immigration line at Manchester Airport, Solomon wondered whether he should present himself. But as he was awaiting the officer's first question, his chance was snatched away. His passport had scanned as invalid. Maybe his face didn't match the photo, or his friend, to protect himself, had reported it lost. The other passengers whispered as he was escorted away by immigration officers. Flanked by border police, he was whisked away to a dark corner of the airport, his heart in his mouth. The officers spoke fast English in strange accents. They asked dizzying questions one after another. He shrank back, allowing others to speak for him. The important thing right now, they seemed to say, was the false document he had carried. Maybe he would let them clear up that mess first before asking for anything else. And so, caught in the jaws of yet another police station, the very place he had lost his father, Solomon withdrew, never mentioning the assassination, the night spent at the mercy of Ghanaian police. Adrift in the foreign noise, he forgot to tell them his story or to ask for help. He never requested asylum at the border. Solomon spent that night in a small cell in the airport. He hardly slept. He thought of his wife and sons, his life back home. When would he see them again? The next day in magistrate's court, his appointed lawyer made no arguments on his behalf. When Solomon was sentenced to 12 months for carrying a false document, the lawyer didn't seem surprised. With a plea entered and verdict handed down, his job was finished. Before he left, he told Solomon, "You can claim asylum after you get out. You'll need an immigration lawyer for that." What nobody told Solomon was that if sentenced to 12 months or more in prison, an asylum seeker is automatically subject to deportation. Solomon didn't see an immigration lawyer until he had finished his sentence. For 6 months, he behaved as ordered and counted down the days to early release. To a long walk in a wooded place, to the summer sun on his shoulders, a private phone call with his sons. But on his last morning in prison, as he was preparing his bag, an officer told him that a fax had arrived from the immigration authorities. "You're going to be held up for a while." Instead of being released, Solomon was held for another week, then transferred to an immigration removals facility in Scotland, where he was served with a deportation order. For how long, he asked? Nobody could say. A detainee might be held for a week, a month, or years. There was no number to count down from, and so, in detention, Solomon began to count his days up. His first asylum claim was refused. "You should have claimed asylum at the border," the first in a string of immigration lawyers said, that first day in the airport. To win asylum now, after the deportation order had been issued, would be a near miracle. "But I didn't know anything then," said Solomon. "I didn't even know the word asylum. They only wanted to talk about the passport." 2 years after losing his father, Solomon disappeared into the mouth of a British detention center. Twice he was escorted by guards from the Home Office to the Ghanaian embassy, twice to the Gambian one. always with an order to request travel documents so that he could be deported. If he didn't cooperate in this, his own expulsion back into danger, he'd be marked down by his case officer. But by now, Solomon understood much more about the Home Office's immigration practices than he had in the airport. Each time a new lawyer arrived, he asked why he had to perform this charade. Each time they shrugged and told him to obey. Sign this, they said, taking great care with the forms that secured their legal aid money. So Solomon went with the guards to the embassies. He sat silently in each interview as the escorts waited in their car. Neither embassy could verify Solomon's identity, and so neither vouched for him. And with only someone else's European passport as ID, there was nowhere for Solomon to go but back to his cell. He lost track of the number of times his asylum was rejected. We have to rebuild this, the lawyer said as the closing gong to each refusal. For years, Solomon lived in one detention center after another, counting his days until they opened into a wasted chasm in his life, until the number grew so big it surpassed one kola nut harvest or a school year, the time it takes for a child to walk, to talk, to ask questions. This is worse than prison, he thought. Maybe he didn't have to be complicit in this torture. He had refused to help with his own deportation, hadn't he? He had power. He had agency over his own body and mind. And so, one day, Solomon decided to do something other than counting. On certain evenings, the smell of frying fish or chicken, peanut butter bubbling in stew, okra and fluffy jollof rice filled the detention center canteen. It made its way through the vents into the rooms where as many as 12 men slept on 6 bunk beds. It moved past the many locked doors that closed off the world. Guards wandered in, grabbed a plate, nodded to the African detainees who had once taken the time to explain each dish. The English they all knew are raised on the blandest foods, and so it was a joy to offer them a taste of home, even if they're your warden. Solomon cooked tonight, the guards would say. I know his food, and everyone would briefly forget what had brought them together in this canteen. When chicken was frying, no one thought about the suicides. How one man tried to kill himself with strips from his bed sheets, another with a blade he had slipped into his mouth after shaving. How those who tried were punished in an isolation cell. When chicken was frying, Solomon could imagine his mother nearby, stirring the stews, unsticking the venison from the pot, seasoning the demota, telling him just how much peanut was enough. Solomon worked as assistant chef from 9 to 5, earning £1 an hour. Sometimes detainees would come to him with a recipe, a request, his old favorites, or English staples like fish and chips. He noted the requests and cooked them when he had the right ingredients. Sometimes he talked to the chef about his life, but he had learned now not to trust anyone, only to stay busy and conjure home with food. In detention, his wife divorced him. I can't do this anymore, she said on the phone. His boys grew up. Months later, Solomon had a call from his uncle. His mother had passed. Now, her dishes were his only way back to her. Stop it.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you. I can kind of smell the aroma of the food just hearing you describe it.
Yes, I could too when he talked.
Thank you so much. You know, the purpose of the tales were to call out the fact that the UK was the only country to detain people indefinitely. And in that tale, there are actually 2 descriptions of detention. One is of the father in an extract before the one you read, and the other one is of Solomon. And I just wondered what the story shows about our willingness to detain people.
Yeah, I think we are often so caught up in what governments and people in charge tell us is right and okay. What is the way that things work, the bureaucracies and the steps, that we just accept, that we don't think about what that really means. Like, what does it mean when one country says that I can take people who are seeking shelter and refuge and I can just hold them and waste entire chunks of their life? Many writers have talked about how making someone wait is such a demonstration and performance of your power over them. And this happens, across just around the world in all kinds of ways. We perform our power over other people when we make them wait, whether we're in a position of, power, or whether they love us, or whether it's like a personal or a professional or whatever relationship. And governments do this to other people. I think what this story shows is that, we believe ourselves as Western countries, as European countries, to be so civilized, to be so much better than some of these other countries. We have the Geneva Convention. We accept refugees. We allow people in. We don't harm people in this way. And yet we have some of the exact same practices that those people are escaping from. We feel that we can snatch someone out of an airport and hold them for long periods of time without any explanation, without any end. This is a kind of mental torture. Many refugees that I've talked to spoke about how the worst burden, the biggest burden of being a refugee is not the deprivations. It's not the, different food that you have to eat, sometimes lack of food, lack of shelter. It's not the rain or the old clothes. It is the waiting. By far, it is always, always the waiting. The not knowing whether your children will have 1 year out of school or whether they'll have 5 years out of school. There is a big difference between those two things. A little child can be forever transformed. Their fire can be forever snuffed out in that time. So, I think it shows a lot about what we're actually willing to be in the name of protecting our own entitlements. We're not as humanitarian by nature as we'd like to think. We think first about ourselves, and I think we need to guard against that.
Yeah, you're so right. And in your tale, we find out that Baba was, that Solomon's father was detained 7 times. And then when you describe what happened to Solomon, it's repeat detention, moving around the detention estate. And it's the same kind of cruelty being played out, even though, as you say, we expect something different from our own land.
Well, and they expect something different too. I mean, everybody has heard of the Geneva Convention. I mean, this is such an important moment in human rights, isn't it? It's really an incredible coming together for the purpose of helping vulnerable people in the world. And yet, and I think people in Iran, where I'm from, and in many of the countries that produces refugees, really do look to the West as a place of potential rescue. They really do think that we bind ourselves to our promises in the Geneva Convention. But I think that we don't do that so much anymore. I think if you look at the way some of the asylum offices around the world behave toward this Geneva Convention, they think of it as a kind of obligation. They want to be seen to, do as they promised, but they look for every loophole, and they parse every letter to find reasons that this particular case or that particular case doesn't fit, and I think that's astonishing.
And you're right about the way people are ground down and destroyed, and it's almost like we deny people the agency even to love and to do good. That's why I love your tale, because in the cooking it's almost like it counters that. But but in the UK we've been living now with the hostile environment. It was the previous one of the Home Secretaries described it as that for almost a decade. And I just wonder, what are the hostile practices that you've seen in other countries, and what do you think the activist tale teaches us about the hostile environment?
Well, I mean, I think stories like this are so important because they show you the effect on the individual, and they show you how unique and wonderful each individual is, and I think that's the power of literature and of stories in general, because I think as people, we tend to kind of be blinded just by our own story. We tend to believe ourselves to be like the only ones living rich, full lives, and we forget that there's other people who are all living a rich, full life, and they all have these experiences. And the refugees are not like this mass of people. They are individual plus an individual plus an individual, and each of them have as much to offer as someone like Suleiman. And so I think the hostile environments around the world, one of the things that they do is that they first of all tell the public, the people, these governments tell the people that to think of refugees as a dangerous mass, like an entire group that's kind of swarming over. That's why they use these metaphors, swarm or flood or deluge, these metaphors that are false and that are disingenuous, because that's not how, migration actually works. But anyway, but what they do is they kind of tell the people not to care, and then at every single level there is these hostilities that are enacted. So for example, at the legal level, there's all kinds of laws. Like for example, in the US, they are constantly looking for, well, let's look at the exact definition of a refugee, and let's be, kind of parse out why this one doesn't fit, etc. So for example, the Geneva Convention talks about how a refugee is someone who can't return home because of a credible fear of danger based on race, nationality, religion, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. So that's 5 categories, right? Now, the original framers of the Geneva Convention, they put in that last category, membership in a particular social group, because they wanted to cover everything else that might possibly lead to future genocides. The Holocaust had just happened, right? And nobody expected that these particular reasons, if you're Jewish, if you're a gypsy, if you're handicapped, those are the reasons that they would kill you. Well, you know what? In the future, there might be other reasons. So let's just go ahead and put in a catch-all at the end, right? But over the years, they narrow that lawyers and like the Department of Justice in the US, et cetera, keep narrowing the definition of a social group. There are times where, like Trump's administration, they argued, for example, that women aren't a social group, battered women are not a social group. So you can come in and you can request asylum and say that my life is in danger, and their response can very easily be something like, we believe your life is in danger, just not for the right reasons. That is not the spirit of the Geneva Convention. That's not why it was invented. It was invented to be a kind of mode of rescue for anyone whose life is in danger and who needs to escape their country and who can't go back there. Now, for example, a country like Iran, where, for example, the moral police often terrorize citizens, and sometimes for personal reasons. Let's say and I've met refugees like this, where a brother or brother-in-law or father or somebody is in the moral police and they threaten their life. And they have the power to do that because they're part of this guard, right? And we're in a political system that doesn't protect the private citizens from the moral police, right? That to me is a good reason for asylum. However, it doesn't qualify because it's a personal matter. That person isn't being persecuted for their political opinion. They're being persecuted because their brother-in-law hates them. Well, you know what? They say everyone has those problems, so we don't have to deal with you. That is a hostile environment. And it's trickled down from the lawmakers down to the gatekeepers, the asylum officers, the people who do the interviews. Now they're looking for something different than what they looked for when I and my family were interviewed. Back then, I really did get the sense that they believed themselves to be a part of something good, that they believed themselves to be the rescuers appointed by the Geneva Convention and, here to rescue those of us who need it. That's not how asylum officers look at their job now. I mean, there's, of course, the kind ones, like, I've heard many stories with kind asylum officers, but they are incentivized systematically to look for like tiny little discrepancies in everyone's story, the kind of discrepancies that easily happen every day in all of our true stories. And based on those, they can reject your entire story as untrue. This is a hostile environment. This is not, the right kind of listening. It's not listening to do humanitarian work, to believe, to, do good.
No, you're so right. And in the UK at the moment, there's a new plan for immigration being discussed by the government, and that involves a kind of 2-tier system of asylum, whereby if you come on a resettlement program, you get treated one way, but the way that they're categorizing another is people on the kind of mode of the journey that people make to the UK.
That makes so little sense to me. How you got here. Well, people, when they're escaping for their lives, they choose the first path. Like however you can get out, you get out. You don't grab the right papers. You don't think about what the best way is. Whatever opportunity presents itself. And it's really sad that there's these kind of arbitrary lines drawn between the refugees, because it divides people, and it also creates this narrative in people's minds that they're good refugees and they're bad ones. They're people who are, cheating the system. They're people who are coming to take things from you. Nobody leaves their beloved home, their grandparents, their loved ones, everything they know, their language, their identity, their job, their sense of who, what they can contribute to the world, their skills, their licenses, to come and do, degrading work for people who look down on them. Nobody wants this. So clearly, the overwhelming majority of people who come and seek asylum, they are in danger. So to draw strange lines between them, I mean, it's a political tactic. I often talk about, migration as a spectrum. When you look at the reasons for leaving, you have on one end of the spectrum, the kind of refugees who are not only refugees, but who can prove it, the ones who might more easily make their way through because they were maybe a well-known activist or someone who was publicly jailed with news articles, etc. That person will probably get asylum. Then, down the spectrum, you have people who can't necessarily prove it. They ran too quickly. It's more difficult for them. Then you have people who left for reasons that are not, covered by all those legal interpretations of the Geneva Convention, but still their lives were in danger. Like, so for example, people who are pursued by gangs in Central America and extorted for money, and they're told that they're going to die. Those people, for the most part, are told that their problem is because of money. They didn't have money to pay the gang, and it's not covered by the Geneva Convention. Well, so that those people are later in the spectrum. And then you have people who cannot survive financially at home, so they're called economic migrants, and so on down the spectrum until you get to expats, people who move for work voluntarily through the system. So if you look at this entire spectrum, I feel like there's a point where we draw the line, where we switch from having an economic conversation to a humanitarian conversation, right? And that line is drawn way, way too far this way, where there's people who are just have lost everything, need our help, our humanitarian cases where we talk about them in economic terms. What are they here to take from us? Are they here to take jobs? Do they contribute to society? Do they give, are they going to be able to contribute tax money right away? That conversation, the word I could think of is uncivilized. It's ugly, it's wrong. To make those divisions among people whose lives are shattered is
You're right. And the scary thing is how the line is tested, so that you mentioned before the hostile environment and the way to listening. And I think you're so right, because there's an expectation that people can give a linear telling of their tale, that they understand what's happened to them in a particular way, that there's no shame, that there's no issues of trust. There aren't things that people hide and need time to be able to delve into, to be able to express. And none of those things are really understood by a system that practices hostile listening.
Not at all. I'm actually writing about this now. I'm writing a book called Who Gets Believed, and it's about storytelling and belief. And it kind of came out of The Ungrateful Refugee, which was very much about the refugee experience. But what you're saying is a big chunk of my book, because when people are traumatized, and then when they go through, something that, is life-changing and often body-changing, victims of torture, for example, who have scars, who've had traumatic experience that go over extended periods of time, they arrive, and the person that they're told to share their story with is someone who's just looking for flaws in the story. Now, meanwhile, the way that they have retained the memory of their traumas is very different from what we expect of narrative storytelling. And one of the doctors at Freedom from Torture told me that she described how we retain memories in trauma. She said that, there's two parts of the brain that retain memory. One part retains the contextual information, and another retains the sensory information, so the sights and the smells and the sounds of what's happening. Now, when you're going through a trauma, for example, when you're being tortured, your sensory memory retention is heightened. You can smell every smell. You can remember, things in slow motion, the way you saw them, the colors, the pain, the sounds. And that's why when refugees often tell their stories, they tell it with those kinds of details, which maybe to the asylum officer feel too vivid. Well, wasn't this 5 years ago? How do you remember the color of the van? Because that is embedded in the memory. Now, the other side is the contextual information. Now, that part of the brain actually kind of it weakens during the memory retention process in trauma. It goes kind of into black and white mode. You remember big pieces of context, but you don't remember how much time passed. You don't remember the name of the street. You don't remember how many miles you walked. These contextual details aren't what's being retained by the brain. Unfortunately, those are the things that the asylum officer wants in order to believe the story and to think it's true. Because how could you possibly not know what day it was? It was such an important day for you. Well, you don't. You simply don't. You've retained the memory in patches. It's all sensory patches, and and to even bring it up again is traumatic. It's painful, and it is shameful, especially in cases of rape. And a lot of torture includes rape. Across all of these countries that produce refugees now. Many people don't talk about it. Many people just would rather lie and jeopardize their case than to admit that that's happened to them.
Oh, I think we need to look to a positive, look for a positive moment.
Have I overwhelmed you, Anna?
Q&A. I was just thinking that as a project, we counter the hostile environment by opening up a new space of walking.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether in Solomon's story, cooking is a way of opening up another space.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that this story shows is that as humans, we have so many ways of coping, so many beautiful ways of coping that have all sort of to do with our connection with each other. How do we help the next person who's been through what we've been through? How do we share our talents? How do we share like the visceral joys of being alive and in the physical body? I mean, food is one of the best ways to share culture, to share love, to care for someone. And I suppose you can do it almost anywhere, including a detention center. And it's one of those things that when done well, I think people can sense what went into it, the care and the craft and the love. And I think, somebody said to me a long time ago that cooking is the only art that uses all five senses. I mean, I don't know. I think writing uses all five senses. I mean, you can't taste the writing, but anyway. But it's true. It's a way to share something you've made with your hands that makes people quickly very happy and to forget their troubles. And the fact that Suleiman tapped into that and very quickly made use of it to help other people who were coming in who needed to forget. In the rest of the tale, there's other people who come in who ask him, why hasn't he considered suicide? And he says, I can't do that to myself. And there's still things here to live for. I think that takes an enormous amount of agency and strength, inner strength and power. And I think it's a marvel when people hold on to it and share it with each other.
I think your tale is the only one that has a moment like when the immigration officers ask for the recipe.
Yes, isn't that wonderful?
That was wonderful.
It still kind of brings tears to my eyes. I was reading the story again today, before this talk, and I read that part and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy. People are people, and the thing is that the unfortunate part is that the thing about asylum officers is that they've had they're part of a system, with bad incentive systems and bad training. I interviewed one anonymously, for my next book, and she was a kind person who found, opportunities, as many opportunities as she could to connect, with the people she was talking to and look for kernels of truth. Unfortunately, she was constantly pulled back into this thing of she had to meet her quota. Like she had to reject a certain number of people. And they don't talk about this, but it actually does go on. So that complicates things, because when humans spend a lot of time together, as Suleiman did with this officer, I mean, they naturally see the uniqueness and the good in each other.
And do you see any signs that people are capable of thinking generously towards people who've been displaced? I mean, I like to think that Refugee Tales is a
Yes.
sign when we're walking in the landscape, but
I mean, this
generally.
is exactly the kind of thing that gives me hope. When
Mm,
people who's, are granted the right to just live a comfortable life and not think about these things, still decide to think about it and to make it their business and to be one of the helpers and to give of their time and their attention, and also to open up their heart to these tragic stories. I mean, it hurts to like listen to these things that it's very easy to turn away. And yet there's so many who don't. The volunteers, the people who organize NGOs and charities, the people who do political activism and use their voices to talk to governments. I think like over the years that I've been doing this kind of writing, I've seen how many kind people there are who find a particular talent in themselves and they say, well, here's how I'm going to use it for the displaced and the vulnerable of the world. And then they do these phenomenal things with that, things that I just can't imagine. I'm like, how do you even have the time to have built all of this that helped so many people? But that is an incredible amount of hope for me. I mean, people are starting to listen to the individual stories and to ignore the voice of the politicians who try to make all refugees look like a swarm. I think that's wonderful. That's the power of stories.
that's lovely. Should we open the conversation up now and see
Yeah,
what questions come our way? I think
that sounds
Christina was joining us to mediate those.
Great. So we've got to the Q&A part of our event now, and I'm going to read out some of the questions. The first one is, have you delivered workshops to refugees in the UK?
Have I delivered workshops to refugees?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of a broad question. I've talked a lot to refugees, and I have individually met with refugees, but I don't think I've done what you would call a workshop. You mean for what? I'm not qualified to do a legal workshop, if that's what you mean. I've certainly done creative writing workshops for refugees in which they can write their stories, and that has been a joyous thing. Talks and individual, one-on-ones.
Great. The next question is, how can we celebrate migration through creative literature?
Well, I think a lot of what I was saying today was about individual stories, and for me, what you can do, the best thing you can do is go and seek out those stories and to share them with the world. I think one of the obstacles that a lot of displaced people face is that they have these harrowing stories, but they can only tell them using their own cultural, ways of storytelling, and those are actually very different from Western ones. So I think anytime there is a friend or a welcomer or a helper, there to help them tell their story in a way that is moving to the Western, Western world, to local people, to neighbors, and to communities, that is an incredible help to both sides. It helps people connect with each other and to understand each other through those stories. So that can happen on an individual and local level, right? But it can also happen by sharing the stories on social media with the world. And I know refugees who've made short films from camp, who've submitted essays and short stories to magazines, who've had their stories translated on blogs, who actually have like in-person storytelling hours. Former refugees in European cities often do storytelling nights. In Amsterdam, I was a part of one where people would get together, and it was impromptu. You could go up and tell a story in 10 minutes, in 2 minutes, in 15 minutes, and that's how people connected. Literature is just it's nothing but ancient storytelling set to paper, and I think that that's what makes it timeless and universal, and just deeply human. It's how we connect with each other around the world, no matter how we do it. So
that's great. Thank you very much. The next question is there a sense of change within the staff at detention centers? Is it positive or is it negative?
well, I think Anna should answer this one while I open my window, because I am sweating. So I'm going to open my window and Anna answer this one, because this is not my expertise.
Okay, so gosh, it's really hard to generalize, but the architecture of detention is very severe, very dehumanizing. I mean, the actual structures of the building in which people are held. and they're run on such a scale that it's quite hard for individuals, I think, to withstand a kind of corporate culture, and to be able to change one to one. The detention centres we work, so somebody went into one of them with a hidden camera in 2017, and there was a panorama programme that showed extraordinary levels of abuse in the centre. I mean, to the extent of an officer trying to throttle someone in detention. And there is now a public inquiry going on into that the 5-month period of abuse in Brook House in 2017. And I guess I urge everyone to follow that in the news, and to see what comes out of it, and to share the findings, the recommendations, talk about it with other people, with the press, with their MPs, because that is a potential vehicle for change in the way people manifest the structure of detention on the ground with people who are detained. So yeah, keep an eye out for that public inquiry.
Definitely. And we've got another question, which is, how can a writer portray the courage, strength, and resilience of a refugee?
Well, I mean, I happen to be a former refugee, so I think that helps. No, but I think the thing about being a writer is the things that you learn over, many years of doing this work is I mean, I guess in MFA programs and in with other writers, we often talk about becoming porous, kind of opening yourself up to the other person's senses, and to try to, really keep true to everything that they sensed from moment to moment. All of those details, all of the kind of almost errant details that in their lives that maybe wouldn't occur in another life. Not like these broad strokes, things that everyone experiences, but the very specific bizarre oddities, I guess, of their life, and to try to populate a story with that, and to go from moment to moment in the most tangible sensory way, and not try to attach, any extra emotion to it, and allow the story to be felt just exactly as it was experienced by everyone. So I think if you are a writer who is taking on the responsibility of telling the story of someone else, that you try to keep grounded in that way. You don't overlay your own emotions. You don't overlay what you think you would experience, your own personality to it. In showing what they did from step to step, and what they saw and what they remember, you capture their personality, you capture who they are, you capture their fears and their traumas, and the reader gets to experience that much more subtly. This is why it's possible to enter other lives, whether they are traumatized and vulnerable people or whether they're not. Entering other lives in this way through the tangible is the work of a good creative writer.
So this is the kind of empathy of story, isn't it, Dina?
Yes, exactly. It is. I think storytelling is about empathy, but I think so much of empathy is lifting yourself and your point of view out, and making that person's lens the lens of the story. And I think that can be difficult. At the beginning, we don't realize how much is actually our own voice, how much we're co-opting or taking that story. And I think that's why, there is so much conversation now around, people who are telling their own stories, or kind of authentic voices of the particular stories themselves, because it is often kind of badly rendered by someone else, but I think that that's not an issue of I think that's a craft issue. You know what I mean? I don't think it's an issue of like identity, or it's an issue of who should tell what story when. It's purely a craft issue. A good writer, one that maybe has decades of experience, would know how to enter that story and to tell it as that person experienced it, and I think that's something that takes a long time to develop. I mean, I'm working on it. I will be working on it for the rest of my life.
Thank you very much. We've got another question, which is, Are detention centers managed by public or private organizations? Do you think this is part of the systematic issues with the process?
That's Anna.
Yeah, detention is a business. It's making a lot of money for the companies that run the centres. And in the UK, it's companies such as G4S, such as Serco, that run the centres. And people make money out of misery in this context. And every time someone gets moved around the detention estate, the person that's moving them is making money, and people get moved around the estate all the time and become invisible in the system. So, yeah, no, I don't know if it's the same in the US, Dina, but in the UK, it's private companies who are making a lot of money out of detention.
Well, I mean, I know the same goes on in the US and prison systems, but I'm not sure about specifically. Well, of course, I know that it has happened at the border in the US too. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess these are the questions that we've received throughout the talk. So I don't know if we should wrap up this with something you might want to add, maybe Anna or Dina.
Oh, Dina, I just wanted to share really that when we first went on our Refugee Tales walks, we feared that we would encounter hostility. And we had kind of well-established protocols for how we would deal with that. But the reality was that people seemed almost relieved to express welcome. And wherever we went, we were just given too much cake. It was left for us wherever we were. Oh. And that the walking at first was a way of getting from A to B, but became kind of transformative. And there was something very special about walking with someone, very different to sitting across a table having a meeting.
Yeah.
And people felt changed through the process.
I can see that. I was so sad to miss it because of the pandemic, of course.
Yeah.
I was looking forward to that. I think you're right that there is something about walking together that binds you. I mean, it's symbolic, the movement from one place to another, but it's also just a kind of communion that is unlike any other, taking a long walk with someone.
So what I love about it is that we all walk kind of looking at the same horizon.
Yes. Oh, what a wonderful way to put it.
Yeah. But I wondered, what gives you hope, Dina?
Oh, what gives me hope is other people and their extreme kindness, and how I encounter it every single day in new and just fantastic ways. It's funny, I always get made fun of by my partner because I tear up so quickly. I think, ever since I started doing refugee work, I like teared up 5 times a day, just at all of the kindness and the outpouring of goodness. You say that your experience in the walks was all of this welcome. And I have found that to be absolutely true in the most unexpected parts of the UK, of France, of the US, in places where you think, these people will be hostile, and they're not. And that's because they have, if they've met one displaced person, often that's enough, because I often say, a 50-year-old father from Isfahan has more in common with a 50-year-old father from like Texas than that same 50-year-old Texan father with his own Texan daughter. Like life happens in parallel around the world, and there's so much for us to find commonality on. And I think when I see that moment where people do that and how it changes them and how they want to continue to be kind, that's what gives me hope all of the time. Here in France, you often see people who are not so much part of the conversation, and who are curious, and as they talk to you, you hear a lot of the language that that the politicians have put out there that they accidentally say, but underlying that is just nothing but good intention. Like, what can I do? How can I help? How can I welcome these people? And I think that's what gives me hope that a lot of the rhetoric is just that. I mean, people's hearts are still continue to be, you know, the open hearts, human hearts that want connection with each other. I think that is the thing that makes me want to continue to do this kind of work, to continue to write. You know, I was actually looking. Right now I'm working on an essay about Iran during COVID, and I stumbled on an old video from the beginning of the pandemic. And it was from Iran, and it was healthcare workers, first responders in a time when Iran was having, you know, so many deaths per day. It was a harrowing moment in the pandemic for Iran. And it was a video of healthcare workers dancing for their patients, you know, and they would put on old Iranian music and do the whole, like, you know, and it was so absolutely one. And they were in the full getup. They looked like they were about to go to space, you know, with all the masks and they were dancing for their patients just out of pure kindness. I mean, that kind of thing happens millions of times a day around the world.
Dina, thank you so much. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for breaking down all these myths with your writing.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I'm sorry for like my visible, I am so hot right now.
Oh, you look just lovely.
But it's been really fun talking to you guys, and it's been a real honor to write for you and to be a part of this incredible organization.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you, Migration Matters, and happy Refugee Week, everyone.
Happy Refugee Week.
Thank